Now, as we continue, we're going to do a moment of review on the life of Solomon. And so I know we looked at Solomon last time. Let's do a moment of review because here it is printed in the text, and it's just really interesting and fascinating. On page 125, we see the accomplishments of Solomon. He requested a heart that shemaws, a heart that listens and obeys Yahweh so that he might discern how to govern and lead the people. This is going to be really important as we as we look at the kingship and its splitting. And so look at what it says, letter B on page 125. He built the temple and he built the palace. What's the big deal with the temple? It's going to be a really important thing when we see the temple destroyed in the exile movement. What's the big deal with the temple? Well, if you remember, and I know this is you might even be getting tired of this, but I like to draw things because we want to make things visual. We want to help people to understand things. And when you are discipling someone, you sitting across a coffee shop table or a living room with them, oftentimes being able to draw it out quickly on a napkin or on a piece of paper in a journal is helpful for people to learn. If you remember the story, and I'm going to try to do this as best I can. God has brought humans into sacred space. It was on a mountain with a garden called Eden. And that mountain with a garden called Eden, the design of the Bible, the design of humanity was that they would take the blessing of God out into the cosmos. But what we saw was there's a powerful force called sin that began to wreck this process. Instead of bringing life out, now humans are bringing sin and brokenness out. And God then brings Israel into sacred space on a mountain, and he creates for them, this is our redemption wandering, he says build a tabernacle, a movable tent. And it just so happens that the tent has in it pictures of trees, a menorah that's designed to look like a tree. It's as if God is building a wandering tabernacle that looks like a mountain. And they're meeting with God at Mount Sinai. And he takes Israel and says, I want you to be my representatives, a kingdom of priests, to take the blessing out to the nations. We can fix and reverse the curse of sin, but I'm going to do so through Israel. But once again, we saw that power of sin continued to own and dominate even God's people, Israel. God chooses a king named David, and his son Solomon builds a temple space. What is the temple? The temple takes this tabernacle and it makes it permanent. The temple is the sacred space for Yahweh to meet with his people. This is me trying to draw a temple. And inside the temple, we have the same exact things. It's a mini Eden. And in the temple, the design will be that the blessing of God is now back on track and can go out into the nations. That's why they're building the temple. The temple is where God meets with his people, that they might dwell with him and he with them, and then he will send the blessing of Yahweh out of the nations. It's really important. It's why when Solomon dedicates the temple, it says the Shekinah. The Shekinah glory just means the dwelling glory. Shekinah in Hebrew means to dwell. So the Shekinah glory comes and it falls on the temple. And it's God's way of saying, I'm with you. Now I'm blessing you to be a blessing. But what we see as we turn the page is Solomon will have the same power called sin that has been dominating the human condition will dominate even God's king, Solomon. And what we see on his failures on page 126, look at verse 3 of 1 Kings 11. He had 700 wives, 300 concubines. His wives turned his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart after other gods. His heart was not wholly true to Yahweh. Verse 6, Solomon did what was evil. This same story is unfolding again and again. God wants to bless the world through humans, but instead sin, they get enslaved by sin, and it is now spreading sin and darkness out. And Yahweh's anger now will burn against Solomon. And we see on page 127, because the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away. Now look at what God says he will do. Verse 11. He says, since this has been your practice and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I've commanded you, I will surely, underline it, I will, God says, you disobeyed, you turned to other gods, I will tear the kingdom from you and I will give it to your servant. God, he declares it. He sovereignly will make this happen. Solomon, I'm tearing the kingdom out of your hand. But notice what he says. However, I will not tear the kingdom out of your hand, but I will tear the kingdom out of your son's hand. Now, God declares it. It's determined. This is God's will. And we see the death of Solomon in 931 BC. There's a reason I'm highlighting this way, because the biblical narrative loves to do this for us. And I'll point it out as we go. Now look at the split of the kingdom. Here's the split. Remember, Solomon, his heart was not devoted towards the Lord. That's the personal failures of Solomon, number 2 at the bottom of page 127. We also see there's been a simmering bitterness and jealousy among the tribes, and that's been lingering over all of the biblical story if you really look at it. The third thing is, we're going to see why the split of the kingdom. We're going to see Solomon's son is an idiot. Turn the page. 1 Kings 11 and 12 is one of my favorite passages in all the Bible because it's interesting, it's ironic, it's a little bit humorous, and then it's also very philosophical. So we're going to take a look at it. Page 128, the split. Here we turn to the split.